Good afternoon, Sanibonan, Molweni, Dumelang, Dimasiari. Today I am going to be talking about 5G. In particular, I am going to talk about what 5G is, what is its applications. I will also talk about what do we need to do in order for us to be ready for 5G implementation. I will also talk about the politics of 5G, United States versus China, who is winning the war, how should we as South Africans approach this matter. And furthermore, I shall talk about how do we prepare ourselves as South Africans and as Africans to be participant in this technology rather than spectators. Now, what is 5G? For us to understand 5G, we have to understand other Gs. So there was 1G, there was 2G, there was 3G, there was 4G, and now we are coming to 5G. So 1G was when we started using cellular phones to communicate with one another using voice. So these were the only phones these were the phones that could only allow you to communicate with one another using voice. Then came 2G. Instead of communicating just using voice, you could send a text message. That is 2G. Then came 3G. 3G now allowed you to be able to surf the internet. So in addition of being able to communicate using voice and text, you were able to go to the internet and sometimes to even send pictures. Now 4G was a faster version of 3G. For example, in 4G, you can be able to download a movie in about 6 hours. Now we're coming to 5G. 5G is going to be very, very fast. A movie that takes 6 hours to download using 4G or LTE is going to take 6 seconds. And you can imagine what it is going to do to communication. You can imagine what it is going to do to performing surgery by doctors. All of a sudden, you can be able to use robots to be able to do it being controlled from the other side because the reaction time is going to be very, very quick. So this is really what 5G is about. Now, what are some of the elements that we need to understand in order to understand 5G? We need to understand something called spectrum. Now, spectrum is about frequency. Now, what is a frequency? A frequency basically means, just imagine you are in a beach somewhere in Durban, and when I was younger, I used to go to a Durban beach called Umgawaba, and you see a wave coming. So a frequency is the number of waves that pass a particular point in 1 second. And if 5 waves passes a particular point in 1 second, we will call that 5 hertz. It is called hertz because the person who invented electromagnetic waves was a gentleman called Heinrich Rudolf Hertz. So sometimes we'll hear that the bandwidth are megahertz. Megahertz is basically bigger frequencies. Megahertz, so that is how we measure this. So now, all this communication that is done, whether it was 1G, 2G, 3G, is done using what is called electromagnetic waves. They are called electromagnetic waves because they unite magnetic forces like a magnet and electrical forces. So what happened more than 100 years ago, people discovered that every time you see a magnet there is electricity. And every time you see electricity moving in a conductor, there is a magnet. That is what is called electromagnetism, and electromagnetic waves are what we use in our cellular communication. So this is what it is all about. Now, nothing travels faster than the speed of light. This is what Albert Einstein said. So these electromagnetic waves, they cannot travel faster than the speed of light. So frequency and the length of the wave is called wavelength. If you multiply the two, they give you the speed of light. So because of that, if the frequency is high, the length of the wave will be low. If the length of the wave is high, then the frequency will be low. Now, coming back to 5G. 5G requires very high frequencies. And these frequencies are allocated to whoever wants to use them, whether it is MTN or Vodacom, by an organization called ICASA, as well as the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies. Now, we have not awarded any spectrum in the last 15 years. And because we have not awarded any spectrum in the last 15 years, it is becoming very difficult to implement 5G without the allocation of spectrum. The Minister of Communication and Digital Technologies, sometimes last year, issued policy directives that are intended to ensure that the spectrum must be released. And now, in South Africa, much of the spectrum that we need is allocated to what is called terrestrial television. So you have two types of television. Analog television is old type of television, and then you have digital television, which uses ones and zeros. So now, for us to be able to release the spectrum, because the analog communication takes a huge amount of spectrum, for us to release that, our government has a project called the Digitalisation of our broadcasting industry. We have been battling with the issue of digitization for the past 10, even more than 10 years. I remember when President Thabo Mbeki was still president, we were talking about digitizing our analog television. We need to do that for us to liberate the spectrum so that we are able to participate in 5G. Now I'm going to go back to that issue of wavelength and frequency. Again, I will remind you, if the frequency is high, the wavelength is low. Now, because the wavelength is low for these 5G technologies, you cannot be able to, a transmitter cannot be able to broadcast for large distances. And because of that, 5G requires you to have more broadcasting mast than 4G. For example, in my village in Limpopo province, I come from a village called Dutuni, and in Dutuni we have a mast, one mast, that actually services all the people in our village and even neighboring villages. You can't be able to do that with 5G. So what is going to happen with 5G is that our street lights are going to be used as masts so that they are able to transmit information. And because you are going to have many of these masts, then it means that you are closer to a mast unlike now where the mast is a little bit far. And the reason why the masts are closer is because the wavelength is smaller. Because it is smaller, we need to have many, many masts. So you're going to see a lot of reconfiguration of how we transmit information. It is going to be much, much closer to our homes. And of course, this is going to have all sorts of implications on those of us who live in urban areas and others who live in rural areas. The big question that we need to answer is, are we going to be able to equally make provision for telecommunication to people in rural areas as compared to people in urban areas? Very, very, very important. So 5G is here. We need to embrace it. We need to adopt it because it is going to be the bedrock of the economy that is already emerging. Some of us call it the fourth industrial revolution. Some people are even thinking that we might be transitioning to a fifth industrial revolution. Now, who are the biggest global players when it comes to 5G? The biggest players are the Chinese. And of course the Americans, because it's still the preeminent technological powerhouse, are also in the game. So what has been happening now is that there has been a war. It's almost like a Cold War, because it's not a physical war, between the United States and China over the control of 5G. Now this poses a great deal of issues to us as Africans as to how we should approach this. Even before then, let us first understand, why is China ahead when it comes to 5G? In 1978, in the People's Republic of China, a new leader emerged. His name was Deng Xiaoping. Of course, we know China experienced what is called the Cultural War, the Cultural Revolution during Chairman Mao's time, and Deng came in 1978. And what Deng was interested in was to modernize China as fast as possible. He even came up with a concept called special economic zones. Those special economic zones were meant to attract technology primarily from the West, and in Deng's mind, after a while, if the Chinese are employed in those technological hubs with lots of Western companies, they will actually start to also understand technology, and they will start making their own technology. Of course, when he did this, he was opposed by the people in the Chinese Communist Party, and that whole period, that whole philosophy of opening up is what he termed socialism with Chinese characteristics. But there were other things that Deng did that puts China squarely on the forefront of the 5G. He said, our leaders of China must be more educated. Secondly, they must be technologically adept. And because of that reason, the current president of the People's Republic of China, President Xi Jinping, is actually a chemical engineer. He succeeded President Hu Jintao, who was a civil engineer. President Hu Jintao succeeded President Jiang Zemin, who was an electrical engineer. So basically, China has been ruled by people who understand first-hand technology. They don't have to be convinced to invest in technology. Some of them have even run technological companies. They have even worked in technological companies. So because of that, and because of the scale of China, China has emerged in the forefront of 5G. Now, what do we do? What do we do as Africans? What do we do as Africans so that we do not just spectate in the 5th generation telecommunication? In 1G, we were spectators. We did not even make a single phone in 1G. Then we came to 2G. Again, we were spectators. Again, we never made any phone here in South Africa, and Africa for that matter, that was able to communicate voice and text. 3G came, we were spectators and customers, not producers. Then 4G came, again we were spectators and customers, not participants. If we are not careful, 5G, not only are we going to be spectators, we might not be customers. Because of course, for you to be customers in 5G, you require a certain level of infrastructure to be there. So, given all these dynamics, given the fact that this issue of 5G has become an issue of geopolitical conflict, how do we get involved? How do we make sure that we do not become pawns in wars that we are not going to benefit, and in many ways in wars that we simply do not understand? So those are the questions that young leaders, especially leaders such as leaders of SASCO and members of SASCO, must start beginning to understand. Now, we need to educate our people across the board. Our people must be able to understand the link between international relations and technology, and be able to use that to position South Africa so strategically that the outcome of our participation in global affairs is that we start getting the piece of the cake that has been shared amongst nations in our exclusion. We cannot afford for the African continent to receive the crumbs of technological developments, to be spectators in this technological development. We need to educate our people. And how do we educate our people? They need to come to universities in South Africa, but they should also go out into the world and learn about how other people are educating their own people, and be able to absorb some of the technological developments that are happening there. Not too long ago, maybe about 6 years ago, a young man walked into my office. This young man was a member of SASCO. In fact, this young man was one of our leaders in our Doornfontein campus. Then he came to my office and said, "Hey, Professor, I see you studied overseas. I also would like to study overseas." And this young man did not even have a master's degree. So what do I do? I looked at this young man, very, very clever, obviously, but also very determined, because it's not just being clever that is going to take us far. It's also being ambitious and being hungry for success. He's no longer a young man. I can reveal his name, Sibusiso Bakana. So I said, no, come and do a master's degree. And after you have done your master's degree here at the University of Johannesburg, then we can talk about how and where you can go and do your doctoral degree. And Sibusiso indeed went and did his master's degree in one of the defining technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence. He completed it with distinction. And then he came to me and said, hey, now I want to do that doctorate. Where should I go? I said, I was educated in America and England. And I think as South Africans, we pretty much understand Americans and the English very, very well. Why don't you go to China? Say, how do you go? I say, I introduce him to the people in our Chinese institute, and ultimately he is completing his PhD in Beijing. We need young people like that who go and absorb technologies from other countries, bring them back so that we can participate. This is really what 5G actually involves. Of course, it requires us to understand electromagnetism. And for us to understand electromagnetism, we have to study physics. We have to study about Einstein's theory of relativity. We have to study about Maxwell's equations. And those are not easy things. Those are not things that come naturally. They require hard work. But the 5G is here, and let us embrace it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you understand what this technology is all about. So I'm going to perhaps just take one or two questions about 5G before we close. But I think I have made myself quite clear. So if you could just write on the internet, I can see your messages, some of the questions that you would like me to address. They say silence means consent. So thank you very much. Ngiyabonga. Ndiyabulela. Ndolibuwa.